Let's get going. Welcome everybody. And we're going to be focusing today on PFAS again and on the EPA proposing to put PFOA and PFOS on the CERCLA list. Some of us who are not consultants or regulators don't really know what that means, and I was definitely one of them. Didn't really understand what difference it would make. So we'll be talking about that today. And we'll also be discussing essentially what's the reportable quantity. EPA has proposed 1 pound. So that means if you release more than 1 pound of PFAS or PFOA in a 24-hour period, you have to report it to the proper authorities. It doesn't mean that you're becoming a Superfund site, but it means it has to be investigated and looked at very carefully. So today we'll talk about some of those things and what it means for farms, maybe who has used biosolids that had PFAS in it, what it means for airports who've been, of course, mandated to use foam to have it ready for fires on planes, otherwise they can't land planes and so on. And we may also talk about fire training areas. What does that mean? Are they normal? Are they automatically now Superfund sites? No, but we'll be talking about it. And to that end, we have two fantastic guests. We have Jeff Longsworth, who is a partner at Barnes and Thornburg, and also one of the coordinators of the PFAS Regulatory Coalition, who puts a lot of focus and emphasis on these things. And we have Shalene Thomas from Wood WSP, global leader, right, for emerging contaminants. Something close to that is your title. And I'm very honored to be moderating this. So I'll start off with a question, Jeff, for you. And that has to be this. EPA has decided that they're doing this under the CERCLA program, right? They have different programs, and would you mind explaining to us what it means that it's being proposed under CERCLA?
Sure. So first of all, thanks for having me. It's my second one, so I appreciate being back on a TRS webinar. So Congress passed CERCLA, or what we call a Superfund, in the 1980s. When we had a large number of what were toxic waste or hazardous waste contaminated sites and needed cleanup. So Congress wanted to give EPA as broad authority as they could to get these sites cleaned up. And so they created this kind of a super statute that they call CERCLA or Superfund. And in legal terms, we say that because it is strict liability. In other words, it doesn't matter if you intended to release a waste or send a waste somewhere, you're liable. There's no intent provision there. It's joint and several. So in other words, if you have any responsibility for the release of a hazardous waste, you could be held 100% responsible for remediating the site where that hazardous waste may have gone and contaminated that site. And then it's retroactive. So you could have done something which would have seemed perfectly legal in the past, and now all of a sudden the release of that, sending something to a landfill that's considered a hazardous substance, again, no intent, and now all of a sudden you could be jointly and severally liable for the entire remediation of that landfill. And it worked. I mean, it served Congress's purpose. It got sites cleaned up. It was kind of, the idea of clean up now and litigate about responsibility later, as opposed to the other way around. So it got a lot of activity going to clean these sites up, and it has worked. But again, it's a very blunt tool created in the 1980s to address circumstances that were probably a little bit different then than they are today.
Yeah, so it's different. It's different that it's under CERCLA and not RCRA, right? I think there is a little difference there too.
Sure. So, I mean, the EPA has a whole variety of statutes they can choose from, and we'll probably get into a little bit more how those statutes really have kind of enabled and created the list of hazardous substances under CERCLA. RCRA is much more sophisticated statute. It's really a cradle to grave on very specific and different and individual waste streams from different industrial operations, different activities. So it's a very different approach than the CERCLA approach. And EPA has indicated that they intend to propose PFAS regs under RCRA in 2023, but we'll just have to wait and see.
Okay, thank you so much for that background. Shalene, I know you work for WSP, right? And you have a lot of clients who are somewhat worried about these things, including the indirect effects that this may have. Would you mind explaining that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for the invite. I'm grateful to be here. Excited to talk about this, as anything PFAS, of course. So from a indirect perspective, I think many of you probably, if you're following any of this at all, you understand that there are both direct impacts and indirect impacts. Direct impacts being the cost required to report the reportable quantity and report that 1 pound, as Gorm said, in the 24-hour period. The indirect costs, of course, are those associated with cleanup. And the challenging part here is that the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, when they reviewed this proposed rule, they identified that this was significant from a cost perspective. In other words, it was an impact of more than $100 million. What EPA has said, though, on the contrary, is that they are focused on direct costs, that they cannot contemplate or calculate indirect costs because they do not know the number of sites or the depth and breadth of the contamination at those sites, the technology that's available to clean up those sites, and of course the standards. So they have calculated in their economic assessment direct costs of $370,000, which I think, as we all know, is something that's not in the depth of reality as to the potential impact here. So we have seen, Chamber of Commerce and others identify what the potential ramifications are, and U.S. Chamber of Commerce suggest, if you're interested, to look at depth at their report. They did do an economic assessment themselves and estimated that the costs associated with the PFOS and PFOA indirect costs, of course, would be over $17 billion and 900 million annually. So 8 to 9 times higher than the 100 million threshold. So there's a lot of industry organizations right now challenging EPA. The docket, I think Jeff mentioned, I think they're up to over 28,000 comments now on the proposed rule. So that's
Awesome.
the challenges with indirect costs.
Yeah, thank you so much. As usual, I forgot to mention in the beginning of the webinar that we have a Q&A button, but anyone can type in a question, and after the first 30 minutes, we will try to answer the questions that come in that way. And you have it at the bottom of your screen if you hover over it. So thank you. Jeff, some people may think that they're a little bit hard done by. I mean, I'm thinking about, for instance, airports. In order to be able to land airplanes of a certain size, you need to have fire trucks there, these striker trucks, and they have been mandated to use foam and have it ready. Otherwise, you can't land a plane. It's even been specified what type of foam that should be on board, right? And that's been PFAS containing what we call AFFF foam. That's just an example. Can there be exceptions made to the rules that follow by designating these contaminants under CERCLA?
Sure. So as indicated earlier, it's kind of a blunt tool, and typically, or in the past, all of the hazardous substances that are listed under CERCLA have come in through other statutes. EPA has the authority to add hazardous substances or chemicals to become hazardous substances under CERCLA, but they've never done it before. So this is the very first time EPA has ever attempted to just add any compounds directly to CERCLA. So in a way, we're, I don't want to say they're making it up as they go along, but we are kind of making it up as we go along. There's no precedent for how to do this, for the type of analyses. Shalene mentioned direct versus indirect, and that's obviously a highly controversial issue. EPA has taken an extremely narrow look at what is direct, when in fact we'd argue a lot of other impacts are direct. I mean, the agency certainly knows that. I mean, you mentioned airports, so airports have to use the firefighting foam that meets the military specification. That's mandated by FAA. And not only do they have to use it in an emergency, they have to calibrate equipment with it, they have to train with it. And for the last 40 or 50 years of these mandates, nobody ever warned airports that this stuff was a problem. And clearly the manufacturers knew it was an issue back, 30, 40 years ago, for sure. We found out in a recent decision in the multi-district litigation that essentially denied the manufacturer's use of the government contractor defense. And in the judge's opinion, that EPA certainly knew by the late 1990s. Nobody ever really warned any of the airports or POTWs or other passive users of PFAS until more recently, the last several years. So you have a number of entities, whether it's airports or POTWs or others, that clearly have some level of contamination based on what they've been required to do, and the good, again, for publicly owned treatment works, they're cleaning water, they're the essential, environmental good stewards, and yet, the PFAS may pass through their wastewater into their sludge or into rivers. Again, nobody ever warned us that these were problems. So EPA has talked about, trying to exempt through what they call enforcement discretion. That doesn't really work because, if EPA, even though EPA doesn't, assert liability against an entity because of enforcement discretion, CERCLA is designed in such a way that other potentially responsible parties can go after each other. And so, that doesn't eliminate liability from anyone. And only Congress can actually exempt parties from CERCLA. So you may have seen in the PFAS Action Act that passed the House, there was an exemption in there for airports. I know that other industries and public utilities also are potentially looking for exemptions. And it's something that certainly needs to be discussed and needs to be addressed. And again, it goes back to a little bit about what Shalene said in terms of the fact that there are far greater direct effects from this proposed rulemaking than EPA has admitted to.
So some other material I know that has PFAS in it, it would be some sludges from wastewater treatment and biosolids, as we call it, basically manure and other things that have been used on farms to basically as a fertilize. What, Shalene, do you know what impact this new rule will have, or this new listing will have on large farms who have taken on biosolids and spread it, and maybe there's many pounds of PFAS in it, unknown at the time?
So it's really yet to be determined. Of course, there's obviously a lot of consternation and concern out there as to what the impact will be for farmers. There's definitely increased scrutiny around the US here with regards to biosolids, and several states taking a very active forward-facing step to deal with biosolids. So we do see farmers getting hit from several different angles potentially where this is regarded. And if you look at on a national scale, just a couple points of reference, I think EPA identified there's 19 billion pounds of sludge that's been spread across farmland since 2016. And EWG had a reference as well that there's potential contamination of up to 20 million acres of cropland. So we know it's an issue, but by which regulatory mechanism will it become, or will it be taken care of, is yet to be determined. EPA is working on completing risk-based evaluations for PFAS solids and biosolids. And just in the last few days, EPA did give some lip service to these passive receivers, they're calling them, which farmers would fit into. They stated that they're prioritizing large industrial facilities and sites where AFFF was released. And they said it's highly unlikely, but not impossible, that they will focus on wastewater treatment plants and passive receivers. So I think they're trying to set the tone that they are not going to target farmers, biosolids specifically, but they haven't entirely closed the door on that. You know, there's no offers of exemptions in the draft proposal right now. So it's still yet to be determined as to what farmers can do. You know, I would suggest contacting the state and to try and understand what the requirements are in the state. There are some tools out there now, thanks to, I think it's the state of Maine, to calculate PFAS risk on your farm. So you can go take a look at that. And then, of course, like several other industries, implement source control strategies to really try and eliminate any future sources. But it is a challenging place right now that they're in.
Yeah, it must be tough also if you have to kind of demand an analysis of the biosolids or something, show it's PFAS free before you accept it. That's probably not something that's routine at all.
No, and I would say, you know, other countries are dealing with this as well. Obviously, we're not alone in this, and trying to be very creative. I think it's Germany who's established a program where they do routine monitoring of crops and things from farmlands, and then make a determination if there's continued risk to the consumer, because they're at a place where they have to obviously use the farmland and have no other mechanisms right now.
Jeff, I already talked a little bit about airports, or we did. I know you're very well connected in this field. Do you think it will have direct impact on airports? So this is just a proposed listing so far, right? It hasn't, PFOA and PFOS hasn't officially been added to the list yet. It may happen in the spring, but you think it'll have direct impacts on airports?
Well, I mean, I think, yes, it's going to have direct impacts in a variety of ways. It's not just airports. I mean, I think we can talk generally, you know, for any site, for instance, that may have contaminated soil. You know, we don't know right now what potential cleanup standards might be. We don't know how to clean up soil. EPA issued their destruction and disposal guidance for PFAS materials back in December of 2020, and they have a limited number of cleanup technologies for water and wastewater and drinking water, but they have no solution for how to clean up soil or air. And so we're waiting, you know, for EPA to revise that guidance at some point, hopefully before this rule might be finalized, so that we know actually what to do with it. Right now, we don't even know what to do with it. So, you know, landfills are now hesitating or requiring testing before accepting soil related to construction. If you're doing construction, are you moving around contaminated soil or clean soil on top of contaminated soil? These are all issues and concerns, because what do you do with it once you identify that it's a potential problem? And again, it's not just the airports, it's anybody with these materials. And then do you stockpile these materials on site until we have solutions? The CERCLA proposal just raises the stakes on everything. So, you know, say you did send contaminated soil off to a landfill that normally would have accepted that soil without question, and it turns out that it is contaminated. And then this rule goes through, again, as I mentioned earlier, the way Superfund is set up, you essentially may have just bought that landfill, or be responsible for finding other PRPs that also sent PFAS waste to the landfills. You know, and the landfills send their leachate to the publicly owned treatment works, which again is a positive environmental thing, but then it just kind of you know, potentially contaminates biosolids, or let's say at the POTW that gets sent back to the landfill. So we have this kind of PFAS loop. So there are a whole variety of implications on how things are happening or occur right now, relative to now the increased and potentially significant liability that CERCLA would overlay on all these activities.
Wow. Okay, Shalene, you often, advise clients to do either treatment on site or maybe off site. Do you think this will make a difference? And will it be more compelling to find solutions where you don't transport the soil that needs to be treated, if we're talking about soil at this time, or how do you think it will affect this on-site versus off-site treatment?
Yeah. So absolutely, it is going to impact it, and it will push, I think, many people to look for on-site solutions. I think Jeff hit on a couple points there where you can't just look at this CERCLA hazardous substance designation ahead of you. You got to use your side mirrors. Look at the MCL coming up in the left-hand lane. You have the disposal guidance and updates coming in the right-hand lane, and then also what's behind you with all the states developing their own criteria. And what it's really resulting in is a push to minimize your liability, and the best way to minimize your liability is keep everything right where it is. So I think there's increasing challenges that are going to happen around waste generation and management associated with the CERCLA designation in combination with the MCL. That's going to produce, higher volumes of waste, more challenges as to where and how you're going to manage and dispose of that waste. So treatment technologies to reduce and concentrate the waste streams, in situ technologies, things that TRS, offers up for fluoride and thermal as an example, and destruction technologies are gaining momentum substantially. And I think they're going to be front and center so that people don't have to push their liability to offsite, as Jeff said, and buy the landfill years down the road.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So the landfilling has often, for some of the work we do in the thermal business, we're the ones who cook the soil to 300-400 degrees and get dioxins and PCBs out, now also PFAS. The only real competing solution we've had so far have been landfilling, more or less, or on-site kiln type desorption, right? Which we hear may no longer be legalized for PFAS, or there's a chance it won't. So Jeff, do we have any idea what this may do to the cost of landfilling PFAS contaminated soil? Does it kind of change dramatically?
Well, I mean, if you're being forced, or if you believe that, it's only safe to send contaminated soil to a hazardous waste landfill, then you just significantly increase the cost of construction on any project that you may have. Again, EPA has not provided us with ways of managing. I know TRS has done a lot of research and has some great capabilities. There's other research going on, both inside and outside of the government on how to manage these wastes. I know there have been some questions about, how does this relate to either the upcoming drinking water standards or the lifetime health advisory levels that EPA has created. And I think what, certainly the lifetime health advisory levels that are now in the parts per quadrillion, it just shows that while EPA has created this kind of 1 pound reporting requirement right now, we have no idea where that reporting requirement will go in the future, let alone what the cleanup standards are going to be. And as you look around at different states that are trying to set standards, it's really kind of hard to say exactly how these issues are going to be addressed. Again, that's why we've been kind of saying the whole time, EPA's kind of got the cart before the horse, where they're creating this remediation cleanup program for PFAS, but we don't really have all the tools in order to do that. And even in the kind of the pyramid of PFAS cleanup, if you think about the fact that we're probably should be and are looking for the sites that have the potential to have a significant impact on the environment or on human health, sources to drinking water, whatever the case may be, EPA has already admitted they have the authority to use certain of their CERCLA powers in those scenarios. So, there are a lot of questions, and And I'm sure that as the question box fills up, there are a lot that we can say, those are great questions, and we have the same question, but we don't necessarily have an answer for you. It's just part of the ongoing discussion. And EPA has announced the other day that they will not extend the comment deadline on, which is November 7th for this proposal. So, people, and Shalene mentioned how many comments are already in. This is going to be a real challenge for the agency to go through these comments and address these issues to try to finalize a rule in the next year, as they have indicated they want to do.
Yeah, I'll throw in a question from Anna Laird, just because it's relevant to this. One of them is, it's quite just, what if you have AFFF waste that you shouldn't be using anymore, so you take it out of your fire truck or whatever, you have maybe 30 gallons in a drum. Where can you take that?
So there are some states that have what they call take back laws. Michigan did a take back of AFFF that has PFAS in it. Wisconsin just announced they have a take back. There are different states that are doing this take back because, again, they'd rather manage it appropriately than have people get rid of it in disparate ways. But what I have heard is even the states like Michigan that have had take back, they've had to send it off to very specialized hazardous waste landfills where that AFFF becomes solidified, kind of gets shrink wrapped and then put into specific cells within those hazardous waste landfills, which is really kind of a way of just kind of delaying what we're going to do with it. I know that the Department of Defense is doing a lot of research on how to clean out fire trucks and how clean is clean, and nobody knows that quite yet, and it's an expensive process. But DoD is obligated to revise the military specification for AFFF by January of 2023, and to then approve fluorine-free foams. And at that point, it's going to be kind of the Wild West, because people are going to be trying to get rid of existing AFFF that they need for safety purposes. They're going to be trying to clean out trucks if they can, or buying new trucks and buying this new fluorine-free foam, which is not going to all of a sudden immediately be produced in a supply that'll satisfy all of DoD, all of the commercial airports, refineries, local fire departments, and everything else. So it's going to be a crazy transition time on AFFF over the next couple of years.
Yeah, we definitely know, for instance, from cleaning out fire trucks for that a typical foam tank could be anywhere from 30 gallons to maybe 500 gallons of concentrate. And we know we have more than a pound in there, right? We probably have 15 pounds of PFAS. We don't always know if it's PFOA or PFOS, but yeah, every one of those fire trucks most likely has close to a pound. And so it's going to be important how that waste, if you will, is if it's released, it automatically is a reportable almost. So hopefully that won't happen too often, and it'll be properly managed. So Shalene, you have a lot of clients that you're advising on this. Do you have anything specifically you can share with us at how you're handling this new situation?
Well, I think for most clients, it's sort of a similar story, regardless of sector that they are in, and the PFAS use that they have is really programmatically understand across your portfolio, whether it's, you have one location or multiple, perform a desktop vulnerability assessment and try to understand what your past, current, and potential use for PFAS are, similar to what DoD's program has been for emerging contaminants. Are any of these things mission critical? If you lost the use of a certain product because it couldn't be PFAS containing, is it going to be a detriment to your organization? And start looking at it from a proactive, bringing in products and product stewardship, supply chain into your facility and operations, through to use, management, storage, and disposal. And then establish a strategy. You need something that is resilient. So whatever your metric is, Jeff mentioned there's no definition of how clean is clean right now. And I'm not sure where and how that will go. It's not any state jurisdictional authority to evaluate how clean a foam truck should be. But they'll fall into the management disposal of liquids or solids, soils and waters. So I think if you sort of establish what your organizational frame of reference is, your risk tolerance, so that you can be nimble enough to, as these things come and hit you, you're better off in terms of how you're managing your liability. The last thing I'll say is, again, back to my driving the car analogy, don't just look what's in front of you or what we're talking about right now, because it's a traffic jam of PFAS all around you in terms of other things that are moving at the federal and state level, and that'll impact what your program is and what your strategy is. So don't just consider this one-off circumstance.
So that this is also a question from the audience out there. One person is asking if there is guidance for how to calculate whether you have 1 pound release in 24 hours or not. I mean, and that one, of course, is very different whether it's soil or water. But is there any type of guidance for, even what analytical method you should be using for your soil and your water, and how you can multiply it up?
So I'll just speak to, we had some of this dialogue when we were preparing for this webinar, and I've had discussions internally with my own team, is what does 1 pound look like? So for me, I deal a lot with AFFF, and if you look at 1 pound of PFOS or PFOA and AFFF, not knowing chemical formulations and volume of PFAS within the formulation, I just went back to the mil spec as an example, and said, okay, the mil spec the current mil spec states that there's 800 parts per billion of PFAS or PFOA permitted in formulation, and then calculated that based on, how many gallons and how many drums of AFFF would you need before you get a pound. And it comes to like 2,700 55-gallon drums for 1 pound release. So unless you have a substantial fire emergency, large atmospheric storage tank or something, you're not using substantial volumes of foam. So I think the average accidental release, and that's concentrate, not mixture with water, of course, it's not going to be a reportable quantity.
Okay. Very good. Jeff, what are you telling your clients to do relating to this?
So a lot of people come to us and say, hey, we hear about this PFAS, we're worried about PFAS, we want to run out and start collecting samples here and there. And I think our advice to people is hold on. This is a process that requires you to be very thoughtful and very careful in how you proceed. As we say, if you look for it, you're probably going to find it, and you need to know what you're going to do with the results, good or bad, and be 2 or 3 steps ahead of the process that's going on. There are a lot of instances in which entities can do kind of a desktop exercise to initially kind of assess what their potential risk would be in terms of where the PFAS may have been in products or in materials they used or disposed of, and then after that, and after a pretty good idea of where you want to go, and talking with some good technicians like Shalene, and come up with a strategy for doing that kind of initial risk assessment. Obviously, again, the whole CERCLA proposal kind of raises the stakes on all of this, but we really don't know how it's going to play out. But it's probably in people's best interest to be doing those kind of initial, thoughtful, stepwise investigation steps now rather than later, even though not all states are requiring it, even though some are. So I think that, the idea is to, again, just to kind of be thoughtful, learn from those with experience in the area, both legally and technically, and be able to put together a plan And PFAS is not just, again, it's not just one thing. It permeates an entire organization. It's an environmental issue. It's a legal issue. It's an HR issue if you have workers that have been exposed to it. It's an economic issue. It's across the board for organizations, and you need to have a complete and thoughtful plan in place for doing that.
Very good. There's a question come from Jeffrey Cipizzi. It's definitely one I cannot answer, so I'm glad I have you two here. Could you discuss the interplay between the proposed 102A designation and EPA's interim health advisories for PFOS and PFOA?
Well, I'd kind of mentioned that briefly, that, if you look at what went into EPA's, calculation for health advisories, and to compare that to the World Health Organization that looked at essentially the same information and came out with a different solution and different numbers, it's hard to predict exactly where the cleanup standards are going to go. And if they go to parts per quadrillion, then there's a lot of technologies and a lot of issues we need to address in order to get there once we start creating all of this Superfund liability. So we really, the interaction is all of the science that's going into the health advisories, that's going to go into the upcoming MCL proposal. These are all things that will drive potentially cleanup standards. Some states already have some cleanup standards in different scenarios and different PFAS compounds, but this is going to be, in part a federally driven program, although obviously state standards come into play.
All right, and here's a very different question, and it has to do with the farms that had PFAS spread with the manure and so on. It's from Catherine, and she asked if there's any research being done to determine how the crop takes up the PFAS, and what's the main concern for the biosolid applications.
So there is substantial research going on, and if you've been in this arena as long as I have, a lot of this started in Australia, and a lot of the initial research on biosolids and plant uptake in general started in Australia. There's a lot more research going on here in the US now, but what they're seeing is, especially with the shorter chain compounds, there's uptake into the crops. And that uptake varies depending on what PFAS are in the biosolids, what the chain length is. Of course, the shorter chains have more mobility and are easier to get uptake into the plants, as well as where they reside in the plant. Whether they reside in the fruit part or the root part, and depending on the vegetable being grown, it varies. So that is one primary concern of it being a mechanism of exposure to humans. The other challenge, I think, is obviously runoff. You distribute biosolids on a farmer's field, any type of precipitation, any water is going to result in runoff. And if those biosolids are contaminated, you're going to then potentially contaminate other surface water, bodies nearby, and our groundwater. So that's also a concern. I don't know if that helps answer the question, but if you want to reach out to me afterwards, I can give you some good references on the biosolids uptake.
So Gorm,
Yeah.
I actually this morning somebody sent me an article about 3M doing research on growing hemp in fields because it seems to uptake PFAS. So it would be a way of pulling the PFAS out of the soil. So one more instance in which hemp is going to, I guess, save our lives.
Yeah. Good. Hopefully you don't smoke it after you go.
No, that would be off limits.
Cool. There's a clarification question from James Elliott. He said it was stated that airports were and are being required to use mil-spec AFFF. Can you please clarify if that is true? His understanding is that only DoD entities had to use the mil spec, and that many airports were using non-PFOS foams for many years.
So if
ahead,
you're
yeah.
a Part 139 airport, which means you're an airport with commercial service, so not every airport in the country is a Part 139. We have small general aviation airports, but if you have commercial service, then you are required by FAA by law to use AFFF, which meets the military specification, or what we call the mil spec. Congress passed a law as part of the National Defense Authorization Act of 2020, which said that FAA had to approve fluorine-free foams by October a year ago, October 4th of 2021. There had been no foams that had met the mil spec. So essentially through smoke and mirrors, FAA said, okay, airports, you're allowed to use fluorine-free foam if you can find one that still meets the performance standards of the mil spec. And if you find one, you should tell us, because we don't know which foam that is. So kind of authorizing the use of a non-existent foam. So right now, if you're a commercial airport, you are still obligated to be using the AFFF with PFAS in it. It doesn't have to have C8, the original AFFF formulations, which, you know, they don't use C8 anymore as of 2015 and anything. It's a smaller chain, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's quote unquote safe. So yeah, so that's the situation with airports still required to use it and spray it on the ground in different circumstances.
One thing I'll add to that, so that is specific to the US, of course. So the question always comes up because European airports, as an example, have been using fluorine-free foams at airports for 20 years now. And it all comes down to the performance specification that's required for the industry. So those airport industries outside of the US do not comply with FAA, of course, being a US organization, and therefore don't need to comply with the US mil specification. And they have other metrics of performance and certifications outside of the US that don't require fluorinated foam at airports.
And again, I'll give you the 10-second or 15-second backstory on that. FAA relies on the mil spec because it was the best performance standard out there. And it was, again, for the military. And it was for the military in a case of a fire on a nuclear submarine or an aircraft carrier or somewhere where the difference between putting a fire out in a minute and 2 minutes may mean the survival of that vessel. So it is an extremely good, it's the best performance standard in the world, and FAA basically just borrowed it from DoD. So it's not like that airports are asking for this kind of standard. And as Shalene indicated, airports around the world are using different types of fluorine-free foam. So hopefully with the military revising the mil spec and by January and approving hopefully fluorine-free foam soon, it'll be something that at least for our commercial airports, they'll have some reprieve.
Very good. And we haven't really touched on costs yet, other than the fact that this rule will mean a whole lot of cleanup and a whole lot of cost. But there is a specific question from Kevin Bromberg, and he says, what's the range of cost of hazardous waste disposal of biosolids into haz waste facilities? Dollars per ton or cost per ton? Any reference that can be reviewed so we can get an idea?
I'm trying to think of publicly available references. I know EPA has been doing some work on that, but I don't know that they have cost references associated with it. The US Chamber of Commerce, that's the report I mentioned earlier that was had developed costs, the indirect costs associated with the CERCLA designation. I think they talk generically about cleanup costs and not waste costs.
Yeah.
So
I don't know, Jeff, if you have anything.
yeah, I Kevin, former SBA advocacy, I can't answer your question with documentation. I can just give you either, and maybe it's a rumor, maybe it's just what I've heard, and that is talking to a client that Actually, I was thinking about sending contaminated dirt to a hazardous waste landfill. I think they were quoted at somewhere around $30,000 a dump truck full. I don't know exactly how many cubic yards that is, but it's certainly pretty astronomically expensive to send material to hazardous waste landfills in bulk quantity.
Yeah. So yeah, hopefully it won't. Hopefully that will not. It would be good for companies like TRS and Terratherm who treat it on site for a lot less than that. But other than that, it's going to be very painful. We are somewhat out. We're out of time now, but the two of you, if there are any of the questions you've seen on the Q&A panel you'd like to talk about, we can definitely extend just a little bit. I've read through as many of them as I could catch, trying to not have too many similar ones come up.
Well, I would just say that, and I've seen a bunch of questions on the 1 pound. Again, I think that EPA's approach to this, that this is only a reporting mandate, is not correct. It's far more than a reporting. Certainly setting it at 1 pound gives them an opportunity to say that there are not going to be that many releases that are going to be reported. Therefore, this rule proposal really doesn't have a significant impact on the economy. I think we've seen today in all this discussion and all the other questions about the other ramifications of this proposal. And, we can get bogged down into whether they're direct or indirect by name, but the bottom line is they are impacts of the proposal, and it's going to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. That's what it's going to be. And it's going to put, EPA has mentioned the fact that they're trying to shift, the burden from the taxpayers to the polluters. Well, I don't look at publicly owned treatment works as polluters. I look at them as essential needs for cleaning up our wastewaters and our sanitary water, and protecting the environment. And so, but yeah, if the liability is transferred to entities like that, they're just going to pass on those costs to their ratepayers. And I think I saw the stat that 50% of Americans don't pay any federal income tax, but they're all paying rates and charges for their different utilities and everything. So there are a lot of issues here, but I think EPA needs to recognize that the ramifications are far beyond just the 1 pound release reporting, and a final rule needs to be able to be implemented in a fair and practical way if they pursue this. Maybe they'll put this off and they'll pursue the RCRA approach. We don't know for sure.
If you don't mind, I have one question for Jeff, and this is not a fair question. But in your opinion and experience, when I think of all these things moving forward, and even just looking at CERCLA in and of itself and how they've defined by fall of next year is their goal for promulgated rule, given that there's all of these challenges, there's 28,000 comments in the docket right now. What's your opinion of the likelihood of this, one, happening at all, and two being delayed from the schedule?
Well, like you said, that's a difficult question, because when you look at rulemakings like this, a 30-page Federal Register notice for proposal seems awfully condensed and short to me for something of this magnitude. So, there are both the practical impacts. We all want to clean up PFAS and get rid of it from our society. Nobody wants it. We want to address this issue. But EPA has a roadmap they're trying to stick to. There are politics involved in this. There are a whole host of issues, and there will be a lot of challenges the agency is going to have to do to finalize a rule consistent with the Administrative Procedure Act. We haven't talked about whether they need to hold a panel for small businesses on impacts under Small Business Regulatory Enforcement Fairness Act or other things, but they will be ripe. It will be ripe for litigation if they proceed and finalize a rule next year, either because they haven't been able to address all the comments, or because there are these legal questions that are out there and people are going to challenge it in courts for years. So we don't know where it's going to go. We don't know where the whole PFAS solution is going to go. We have all the multi-district litigations around the country, and we learn new things every day about PFAS. So we're in for a ride. I wish I had a really tough question to throw back.
To throw back at me.
How do you clean it up?
I don't know. I think we're out of time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. We'll stop it here, I think. The next webinar will be in December. We haven't set a firm date yet, but it actually, curiously enough, will be a webinar that focuses on AFFF clean out of fire vehicles, and it will be showing one of our recent examples on the West Coast where we took a fire truck and we basically got the AFFF concentrate out of there, saw how much PFAS was still circulating in it, then did the conventional triple rinse that you can do and saw how much PFAS came out with that. And then we did a more thorough rinse with this perfluoride solution and saw a lot more PFAS come up. So that's going to be a webinar focusing on that and on just one of hundreds of challenges, right? When we were having to clean up PFOA and PFOS. First of all, how clean does it have to be? It's not really even set for that. It's not set for soil either in most states. So that webinar, hopefully most of you will return. We'll broadcast the date. And for now, thank you so much, both of you, wonderful panelists. And thank you for listening, everyone.
Thank you.